During the special session, the Texas legislature also passed a bill overhauling the state's bail system. It's another win for Republicans and Governor Abbott after the priority bill stalled because of the quorum breaks. The legislation restricts how criminal defendants awaiting trial can be released on personal bonds, which does not require cash up front. Our Nikki Griswold joins us now. Now, Nikki, Governor Abbott was determined to get this bill across the finish line.
That's right, Rena. The governor has said the major changes in this bill are essential for public safety reasons. Supporters say that it will keep people who are considered to be risks behind bars pre-trial, but civil rights organizations fear it will mainly target people who can't afford bail.
There really are people that should not be in the community. They should not be given a personal reconnaissance bond.
A major GOP bail overhaul bill could soon restrict people accused of certain violent crimes from being released pre-trial on personal bonds, which don't require cash up front.
People were being released like popcorn on PR bonds, and they ended up killing somebody. We've got to realign the scales of justice to where we're not releasing the same, violent criminal element back on the streets.
But those people could still be released if they have the money to pay bail.
Cash bail has nothing to do with public safety. All it means is that if you have resources, you have money, you can pay your way out of custody.
Critics of the bill say it will disproportionately impact people from low-income and marginalized backgrounds.
This matters for people who are what I say called the poorest of the poor, who simply don't access the financial resources to pay cash bail or to pay a bondsman.
Supporters of the bill say it's necessary to keep people thought to be dangerous in custody before trial. And before setting bail, judges would have to go through training and consider a defendant's criminal history.
If they've taken into consideration all the factors and including their ability to pay, and they set a bond that they cannot afford, then the constitutional requirements have been met, and then it's just that's what the impact of their risk to public safety is.
The bill's opponents say that banning personal bond release for certain criminal defendants awaiting trial is troubling.
Everyone should be concerned about how this bill in some ways shifts this idea that people should be presumed innocent to a presumption of guilt and that people should be held in jail pre-trial. That is not what the norm is supposed to be under our Constitution.
Civil rights organizations say that they plan to issue legal challenges to the bill once it becomes law.
Before voting to approve the bill, lawmakers removed a controversial element of the bill that banned charitable organizations from providing bail funds for people. That was common last summer when protesters were arrested during the Justice for George Floyd demonstrations. So the provision caused an outcry among activists who said it directly targeted protesters. Reporting in the studio, Nikki Griswold, Capitol Tonight.
Thank you, Nikki. While the state's overhaul of the bail system is awaiting Governor Abbott's final sign-off, there are several new laws addressing criminal justice now in effect. This includes a ban on chokeholds unless it's necessary to prevent officer or bystander injury or death. Officers would also have to intervene if a fellow officer is using excessive force. The Botham Jean Act, named for the Dallas man who was shot and killed by an off-duty police officer, requires police to keep body cameras activated during the course of an investigation. Larger cities that cut police budgets wouldn't be able to increase property taxes or utility fees, and another law imposes criminal penalties on protesters who block emergency vehicles. Joining us now is Howard Henderson, founding director of the Center for Justice Research at Texas Southern University. Mr. Henderson, thank you so much for your time. The murder of Houston native George Floyd led to hopes for criminal justice reform in Texas. Let's take a listen to what Governor Abbott said following Floyd's death.
I'm here to tell you today that I am committed to working with the family of George Floyd to ensure we never have anything like this ever occur in the state of Texas.
Do you feel like the state has fallen short of this commitment?
Well, I think it's obvious that there have been huge strides taken in the wrong direction. Immediately following the death, the murder of George Floyd, politicians from around the country, even in the state of Texas, were calling for police reform. But what we ended up with was something totally different. There were moves, I think, when you look at police chokeholds, when you look at the passing of Botham Jean's law, what they call Bowles law, where they require body cameras to be worn by police officers at all times, when you look at criminalizing homeless camping, when you look at the active shooter alert system, I think you've seen moves in some right direction and you've seen a lot of moves in the opposite direction.
You know, you mentioned all those measures that did pass, but most of the provisions under the proposed George Floyd Act did not pass, including one that addressed officers' legal defense from state civil rights lawsuits. How would have passing that made a difference?
Well, I think when we were in Austin this session and having conversations with policymakers and police chiefs and other decision makers, they understood the need to curtail police accountability. But what we saw also at the same time were police union representatives fighting in the opposite direction. I think many policymakers had the right intention, but by the time you finish with the lobbying and the process that it takes, we ended up not being able to do anything with qualified immunity, which I think is a step in the wrong direction.
Police groups argue that taking away qualified immunity would compel officers to leave the force. And what's your response to that?
Well, the research argues the alternative. What we know is that qualified immunity motivates officers to act in the wrong direction. It motivates them to be involved in more misconduct. We've seen that with studies all over the country. But I think there's a line that can be drawn in the sand here. I think there's room for compromise on both sides, and we think that the case, and we've had conversations with police executives around the state, that I think that there are some behaviors that we understand that should not be protected by qualified immunity, and there's some that should. I think that if we bring the people to the table and have an honest conversation about these issues, I think there's a resolution there.
The legislature passed the bail overhaul bill, sending it to Governor Abbott's desk. If this does become law, how do you think this law would play out in the criminal justice system?
Well, as anything, there are always unintended consequences. I think with bail reform, we understand the highly charged nature of this political reality. You have policymakers on both sides of the aisle who are arguing that there's benefit to them by passing or not passing this law. The way it's actualized in these local communities is kind of what we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. But it is my hope that at some point we can get to the table and have an honest conversation about the best approach to deal with bail reform, which is a tricky issue and a constitutional right.
Are there ways that lawmakers can actually rewrite the bail system while addressing the concerns about public safety, but also ensuring that poor people aren't discriminated against?
Yeah, I think district attorneys have an opportunity to conduct widespread decisions that would allow them to release low-level nonviolent offenders. But at the same time, there's a way to ensure public safety. But because of the political nature of this conversation, it becomes so politically charged that no one can ever deal with the issues at hand. And that is, how do you maintain public safety at the same time limit bias toward individuals who may not have the economic means to be released by bail?
In Texas, local governments will now be punished for cutting law enforcement budgets. How much of that rhetoric around this defunding police movement do you think affected police reform in the state?
Well, I think it's behind a lot of the lack of reforms in these places, because here's what we know. The defund the police movement, we understand that was a term that many people could not get behind. But I think if you listen to what people were saying, they were calling for a different type of policing. In our research, we found that in many of these communities, they're not anti-police, but they are anti-bad police. And I think if we could sit together and bring the right people together to have a conversation without the politics, I think we can get to some of the solutions to these problems.
Howard Henderson of Texas Southern University. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time.